can you give me a guess of how many people live in India? I'm sure you know the random figure. Let me see what you know.
1.3 billion.
1 point? 1.3. Is that correct? Is that high or low?
We don't know.
No one knows, right? So it's approximately 1.312, which means we are already talking about a difference of 10 million as an error rate. And it's highly accurate. So we're talking of a country in which the population's error goes to approximately 10 to 100 million. So when you talk to people, how many people, so you talk to an Indian, what is the population here? They will tell you, yeah, around 1.2 to 1.3 billion. And then you must say, well, hang on there. This is a difference of 100 million people. 100 million people is just your error rate. So imagine the size. And then they tell me to talk about the education policies and education structure in India in probably an hour or so. So that's quite a tall order. So what I'm going to do now is give you snippets and salient features of education system in India. I would like you to keep this conversation or this sort of in a dialogical form, in a conversational form. So stop me whenever you feel like. How many of you have been to India before? And that was probably tourism mostly, right? I'm assuming that higher education system or education system in India is not quite something that you've sort of exposed to. Yeah, I'm assuming this. Also to get a sense of what kind of background schools, law, political science, economics, what kind of backgrounds do you guys come from? Any big majority here of a particular? Oh, all of you are lawyers. How many of you are not lawyers then in that case? 2, okay. 3. Well, that's I'm going to be sympathetic to this. I have a bad habit of reading judgments, particularly those judgments that relate to higher education institutions in India. I'm mostly somebody who works on higher education, but I probably will be able to talk a little bit about school education as well. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some salient features which characterize Indian education system. Some of these features might look very normal to you for a country of this size and of a particular, I mean 7 years ago, World Bank moved India from being poor to middle income country, which was quite a surprise to everyone, particularly much to the annoyance of those who learned that the aid from UK has stopped. Well, UK has stopped aids for most places anyway, they may. But this transition has given a very different outlook. So what I'm trying to say is that Indian higher education system is composed of these characteristics rather than a linear narrative. I'll try to create a narrative too, but do stop in between if you feel like, so as to explain. I am probably going to be walking around. In case this is problematic, let me know and I can be stationary. It's just a habit, just like Indian educational system. Just keeps walking around here and there. And also because I will need the computer, so I will actually probably station myself mostly here. I won't eat this, don't worry. Okay. Okay, I'm Yogank Goyal. I teach economics, but I studied engineering as my undergraduate degree. After that, I went to study my master's in law. Engineering I did in India, school also in India, of course. And after that, my master's was in Europe, continental Europe, Germany and England, Manchester and Hamburg. My PhD, which I recently finished a couple of years ago actually, was in economics. So master's was in law, but it was law and economics, sort of that interdisciplinary program, and the PhD was in economics. Higher education as my interest area does not necessarily come from my doctorate degree, so my dissertation was not on education, or from my academic writings. I've written significantly on higher education, but mostly short pieces, not extensive lengthy pieces, which are, actually, no, I have written on higher education as lengthy pieces as well, but that's not my primary area of research interest. The reason why, however, I talk about and I engage with ideas on education is because I was one of the founding faculty members of this university. So I joined this university as the 4th or 5th employee back in 2009, and so I learned about educational system experientially. In order to establish the university of this size, I had to go through all possible all possible bylaws of the local municipal laws, land acquisition laws, everything, and then be able to implement them. In addition, in order to recruit students, I traveled around the country going to every school and college. So in other words, without knowing, I was absorbing a lot about what's going on in education sector in India. And then later on, the last 2-3 years, I've begun writing on it. And turns out that there is huge dearth of research in this sector, which is quite interesting, given how badly it needs sort of intervention from scholars. Jindal University also has an institute, International Institute for Higher Education Research, and I am also part of that institute. So that explains a little bit of my location. But having said that, I must tell you that there are millions of answers that still remain unanswered, millions of questions in education sector in India. And in order to grapple with them, I engage in conversations. So I would really like, if this is a conversation where you can put forth questions or probably comments. I will go through a series of few tables and graphs to show you certain interesting features, but mostly I'm going to give you snippets of what are the characteristic salient features that define or that explain or that sort of give a characteristic color to our education system. So the story goes back to 1830s actually. Actually the stories always go back to a long time ago, right, 70,000 years ago. But in India, we had a very decentralized system of education until British came. And in 1830s, this was also one of those, for many of you who might know, was an anthropological moment, particularly in the Western countries, when they had started, Napoleon's engagement in Egypt in particular, and trying to sort of map out exactly what's an Egyptian face looking like, or the pyramids looking like, or for instance, the mosquitoes that are walking looking like. So in other words, mapping colonies was an exercise that began with colonization in early 19th century. This bug of mapping who you govern statistically was also bitten by the British in India. The interesting part, however, is that early administrators of colonial India from Britain, we now call them as scholar administrators, because many of these people who were asked to govern certain pockets of India, regions of India which were under British dominance, they ended up writing a lot about what they saw. And that gave not only today for us, for instance, a huge breadth of knowledge about our own country, but to them in particular. To give you an instance, to give you an example, so you've all heard of John Stuart Mill on liberty, right? The famous or the infamous book that he wrote. His father, John Stuart Mill was born in India. His father, James Mill, he was sort of employed in the East India Company. He wrote a 10-volume set on history of India, never visiting India once. So at the point of time when his father was working in East India Company, the most authoritative text on India was written by a guy who had never come to this country. The reason why he could do this is because he was part of the auditor's office in London, and every document and paper that was produced out of East India Company offices in India had to go through him before it was deposited in the records. So he had access to an enormous amount of information and knowledge about India. Think about, and because India was a very, very warm and hot country, which British didn't like much, they would mostly ask Scottish to go there. And so most of our governor generals had been Scottish. Now think about somebody who had never been out of England or out of Britain, so to speak, is asked to govern the territory and size of people 5 times the size of London. So they had no idea about what they're going to do, which is why documenting and creating knowledge inventories became important. In this process, a man called Thomas Macaulay was also sent to India. This guy is famously today known as somebody who wrote the Indian Penal Code. So the horrifying result of that which is prevalent today, for instance, in the illegality of homosexuality, for instance, is the result of Macaulay's Code. So IPC Code is also called as Macaulay's Code. But another reason why he's an important figure in this history is because he also created the structure and philosophy on the basis of which higher education in India in particular was mapped out. In an important speech, and maybe I have that speech, yeah. So in 1835, this guy is giving a speech in which he's charting out and sort of mapping out what are his ambitions, aspirations, or plans or vision for higher education in India. And I can send this to you so you can read through this entire text. But quite interestingly, a particular paragraph in this sums up his entire speech in, I think it's paragraph 30, Yeah, let me read paragraph number 34 along with you. In one point, I fully agree with the gentleman to whose general views I am opposed. I feel with them that it is impossible for us, with our limited means, to attempt to educate the body of the people being Indians. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of population. This is quite a famous paragraph now, in which explains the kind of the origin of a particular institutional structure, which has then since remained path dependent in nature. If I go further up, so for instance, in paragraph 33, I'm reading from here, we ought to employ them in teaching what is best worth knowing, that English is better worth knowing than Sanskrit or Arabic, that the natives are desirous to be taught English and are not desirous to be taught Sanskrit or Arabic, that neither as languages of law nor as languages of religion have the Sanskrit and Arabic, which were the prominent languages. I mean, they were not colloquial languages, they were kind of court languages. Any peculiar claim to our encouragement that it is possible to make natives of this country thoroughly good English scholars, and that to this end our efforts ought to be directed. Now, the reason why I am bringing this up is because close to 21 years later, India established, or British established, the first universities in India. The year was 1857. They established University of Bombay, University of Calcutta, and University of Madras. Delhi came much later. These three universities predate the emergence of Indian University Act by several decades. They also predate the emergence of London University Act. However, the model followed was very closely resembling the University of London. The King's College London in particular, because it predated University of London. One of the important things in establishing these universities was the English's viewpoint that universities can be hotbed of dissent, and therefore what ought to be taught must be highly centralized. So what they did was this. Each of these universities, so first of all, they borrowed the model exactly as it was in England, but they made certain tweaking in it. The most important tweaking was the high level of centralization within the universities. This centralization allowed the university officials, who were mostly British, to have a very, very keen monitoring and supervision on what is being taught, how are the examinations being conducted, and what kind of pupils are coming out. Interestingly, therefore, you'll notice, like if you go deeper into it, you'll notice that most subjects that were taught in these universities early on were subjects that created clerks more than the subjects that would encourage creating original thinking. And therefore, English language was considered to be a more important subject than physics or botany or zoology. Almost all of these universities, and in the beginning there were just three, all these universities were headed by a British. This guy was de facto, the person's ex officio position was either the Governor General of India or the governor of that province. So Governor of Madras, for instance, was the, I now exactly don't remember what was they used to call it provost or the chancellor, but the head of the institution, head of the university was the governor of that particular province. Few universities came much later, University of Delhi, University of Lahore, University of Punjab, University of Allahabad. But each one of them also were British established universities headed by the Governor General of that particular province, mostly recruiting people at the whims and fancies of the British, ensuring that people do get education in English, which was kind of philosophy of Macaulay, but to create people who can act as very, very efficient clerks for the British administration. The change happened in 1912 or 1913. I'm not exactly clear about the year, but somewhere around in that decade, when Sir Syed Ahmad Khan established what we now call as Aligarh Muslim University, and Madan Mohan Malvi, I can send these names to you, established what we call now as Banaras Hindu University. These two universities were established as philanthropic grants by rich Indians, Hindus and Muslims respectively, in these two cities, which were not established by British. Okay? So these, and both of them, both universities were established by scholars. So Madan Mohan Malviya was a very, very prominent Hindu scholar. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was a prominent Muslim scholar. When these universities were established, the British felt the need to pervade through the higher order of administration in order to be sure that the university is being meant for what it is supposed to be meant for, driven by the philosophy that Macaulay had originally triggered. So they created a position of a visitor. A visitor, and I think in Australia, the position of a visitor of a university exists, right? If I'm not mistaken. Do your universities have a visitor? So there is a vice chancellor, there is a chancellor, chancellor above the vice chancellor, and then there are registrars and so on and so forth. But in addition, there is a position called visitor. And I do know that Australia is having, engaging in conversation to phase out this position because it's kind of needless. But are you aware that which university are you all from? Monash. So does Monash have a visitor? The visitor, can you Google this for me if you want, if you can? Just kind of curiosity. The head of the institution is called the chancellor in Monash? Or the provost? Who is the head of the institute? What is the designation?
The head is the chancellor.
The chancellor. So chancellor, vice chancellor, right? These are the two big guys in the hierarchy. Is there somebody called a visitor?
You've got a visiting fellow.
No, not visiting fellow. A visitor is generally above the chancellor. And it's a very nominal titular position. If Monash doesn't have it, if you don't know it, maybe Monash doesn't have it. But some universities definitely in Australia have them. Now the position of a visitor is a very peculiar position, mostly prevalent only in Anglo-Indian world, including India. I am aware Nigeria has it, and I was thinking maybe Australia has it too, but it's fine. I think you guys have phased it out. So visitor of the university was then established by the British. This is a guy who is the head of the institution above the chancellor, who has the right to, at that time the rights were different and now the rights are different. So for instance, the visitor of all central universities in India is the President of India. At that time, for both Aligarh Muslim University and Banaras Hindu University, the visitor was the Governor General of that particular province. So in other words, what I'm trying to tell you through this story is that the British ensured a very high level of intervention in the governance structures of the university, and consequently, by virtue of which, even in the type and the kind of curriculum and pedagogy that was organized. This made sense at that time possibly, but it did not and does not really make sense today. We do know that universities today must be autonomous and independent institutions. Sad part of the story is that you know the concept of path dependency. So if something inefficient will continue to go on because it has continued to go on. So for instance, how many of you had to buy a converter to put into your charging point in India, right? It just doesn't make sense to have different types of 3-pin plugs around the world. The world would be a much better place if all the countries use the same type. But because the switching cost is too high, therefore people don't choose to do so. The QWERTY keypad that you use on your computer is not the most efficient way of organizing alphabets. It was done. Doesn't even know why is the keypad always QWERTY?
Frequency of letters.
Sorry?
Like the distributed depending on.
Correct, but why QWER and not WEQR? What gives us this particular randomized array of which is existing around the world? Like most computers, I would say most 99.9% computers use this same type of keyboard. So this guy who invented the typewriter in the beginning, and you used to press your, and this is off the topic, used to press the button through your. It used to be a lever that you had to push using your legs when the numbers would jet onto the paper. But because that typewriter was organized in sequence of A, B, C, D, you quickly knew where A and B and C, D are. So you would use your legs very frequently. The buttons were at the bottom. Because you would do it quickly, it would jam the printer, the typewriter. So he disorganized them here and there, so that people have to find where the next letter is, and it takes a few seconds, and it does not get jammed. Most typewriters then that came about afterwards actually followed and copied the same model, and that has continued since. I know American Navy wanted to organize, they sort of devised a different type of keypad, where in letters which occur together closer to each other so as to make typing faster, but then it got phased out because the switching cost is too high. In fact, you might want to take a look at this paper by Paul David called QWERTY, Clio and the Economics of QWERTY, in which he explains why certain inefficient institutions get logged in time. And this is exactly what happened in India. Certain things are inefficient, but they get logged in time because switching costs become too high. In order to be able, and this switching cost in India is high because higher education, and quite frankly, this is a story for not just higher education, but for pretty much any other sector that you would imagine. Our police services did not quite change in 1947 when we got independent. Our administrative services, those reforms never happened in India. The election system continued from 1935. Of course, the earlier the election systems only used to be executed in provincial states which were given some sort of semi-autonomy by the British, but after that it was copied everywhere. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that stories of India remain fairly linear, and in 1947 not much changed. The government changed, yes, but quite practically, the structure in which the society is governed or the structure in which the government is governing remained almost the same, and this continued. There have been 4 education policy statements, 46, 64, 86, and then recently in 2016. Most of these policy statements have talked about extremely impressive ideals to change higher education system, but quite practically nothing has happened on the ground. I wonder quickly, how many of you had a chance to read the piece that I had prescribed for this? None. Okay, I mean that's fine. You don't have to feel sorry about it. I'm used to coming to a class where students haven't read. Maybe it's a mark of a particular generation. But do take a look. If you read, it's a very easy read. Do not focus on the data because it's rather old piece. Many things have changed since that piece was written, but the context which is built and the storyline which is kind of narrated is fairly accurate in terms of what happened. One other thing that happened is that education became just like any other public service in India, highly corrupt, and more importantly, a source for a symbolic source of power for every government in place. This continued until the 80s and 90s, after which privatization started happening, and that has happened at a massive scale. In speaking about, so let me just show you this particular slide. Okay, now what happened in India after that is that the first university came about in 1857, and the first regulatory body for universities came in 1956, University Grants Commission, which is the largest body and the overarching body that sort of engages in governing higher education institutions. But the interesting thing is this: before 1925, there were not a single regulator as such for the universities. Probably they didn't need any because the governors themselves were part of the university administration. There were 23 universities that were established already from 1857 until 1925. Now this is top 100 universities. So I'll talk about the ranking a little bit if I get some time. But this is based on something called as NIRF, National Institutional Ranking Framework. Driven by the impulse of ranking of QS and Times Higher Education. I'm sure you are aware of these names, the QS ranking and Times Higher Education. So in India, we have sort of very recently they established their own ranking system. The government's Human Resource Development Ministry organized this ranking system which is called NIRF. You can Google it. In that ranking, out of the 23 universities that were established before 1925 or before any regulation, 13 of them feature. Do you see my point? So out of the total number of universities that were established before regulation, 13, which is more than 50% of those universities, feature in the top 100 universities of India today. You start loose coordinators, so there were some sort of policies that had come about, but no specific hard regulator from 26 until 56, because the main regulating body of higher education came in 1956. But from 26 until 56, policy plans had begun to be rolled out from New Delhi, and during this time, until 1956, a total of 37 universities had been established. Out of the 37, only 15 today, out of those 37, 15 today feature in the top 100, which means only 2 in this balance. So there were 14 universities that came from 26 to 56, and out of those 14, only 2 feature. What am I trying to show here? I'm trying to draw the correlation between higher regulation and reduction in quality. When the regulator came about as in a University Grants Commission until 1992, and the reason why 1992, I'll just tell you, the number of universities had skyrocketed, 250. But the total number of universities that today, out of those 150 that appear in top 100, is only 38, which means only 25% of the total. And then after 1992, what has happened is, I mean, as of now, we have a host of regulators trying to regulate a number of aspects of universities. So for instance, Medical Council of India regulates all the medical colleges, Bar Council of India regulates the law colleges in addition to UGC. How many regulators? Quite practically nobody knows. My last estimate, by my own research, talking to people and through internet, going to the government, gives me a number of around 22 to 23. So as of now, from 92, these regulators started emerging, largely due to courts' decisions. So as of now, around 20 to 25 regulatory bodies on a daily basis intervene in the administration of universities in India. And that tells you something interesting. Today we have around 799 universities. This is the exact number. We have 799 universities. It's quite a leap, right? From 1925, from 23 until 800. 800 universities, big numbers are 800 universities, 40,000, a little more than 40,000 colleges. So it's a huge number. But the number of universities which had come about from 1993 onwards, only 6% of those universities feature in the top 100 list of India's own ranking system. This tells you something. This tells you 2 things. Number one, the universities' numbers have been increasing, but not the quality. And number 2, one of the reasons, possibly, for a mediocre quality of higher education institutions in India is the complexities of bureaucracy and regulatory bodies in India. That said, let me quickly switch to something that has happened this year. Because I'm talking about rankings, might as well use this opportunity to explain you a very new characteristic feature which is emerging for the future. So for the last 5 to 10 years, all right, let me ask you this question. You know, Times Higher Education, you're all aware of it. It's like a prominent ranking body, highly arrogant at that. In doing it, can you give me a random guess of how many Indian universities feature in the top 200 universities in the world by Times Higher Education? Any random guesses? If you know it, well, you can tell me. Otherwise, if you don't, just guess. You can just throw me a guess.
1, 2.
1 or 2? Sorry? 2, yeah.
4.
4. So the number is 2, but that doesn't matter because the number remains close to 1 and 2, which has remained in the last 2-3 years. Before this, the number was almost 0. I mean, there's nothing called almost 0. The number was 0, right, in the ranks. It is only in the last 5 to 7 years that the government has made a concerted effort to ensure that, or to push universities to apply for rankings and to secure a position, a decently respectable position in rankings. Now that's quite interesting, right? There are 2 things. One, the fact that none of the 800 universities feature in the top 200 of the world. We're talking about a country which is securing headlines in many newspapers for the economic growth that it has assumed along with other countries, other middle-income countries around the world in the last 10 years, but not having a single university that could be called as a world-class one. So that's interesting, which tells us something about the quality, right? So, and notwithstanding, of course, the problems in the ranking itself. So ranking itself is biased in favor of certain type of institutions. So for instance, most of these rankings, Times Higher Education, QS, or Shanghai Jiaotong, these rankings rely heavily on publications, and publications will heavily rely on publications that happen in the STEM sciences, right? The science, technology, engineering, and medicine branches. So universities that are purely social sciences will always lose out. Second, our university system was built and driven on the system of England, in which you have, let's say, University of Oxford, and then it has several colleges. And similarly, here you have University of Delhi and many of its colleges. So each of these colleges may be individually very good, but at a university as a whole may not be very good because there are also mediocre colleges. All kinds of reasons. But I don't want to get into that discussion as to whether the ranking is an appropriate way of benchmarking institutions in a country like India, which has its own problems and must be ranked on its own in a different way. But it is important that not even a single one was there until 2-3 years ago. The second thing is the government's impetus that no, we must be somewhere there. It is shameful that a country of 1.3 billion people does not have a single university which is world class in its own repute. So what the government did last year, and this is probably something that is going to redefine higher education in India in the years to come, is that it has created a new law in which it claims that Indian 10 public and 10 private universities will be selected out of a group of applicants of whoever applies to this particular structure, who will be knocked out from regulatory bodies' oversight. These institutions will be called as institutions of eminence, IOE. So if you run a Google on Institution of Eminence Act, you will get the whole act. I think it's 6 to 7 pages. The statute that establishes these universities as institutions of eminence. Public universities will also get a lot of money. It's to the tune of 100 crores would be how much? 6 million, 100 million USD approximately over a period of next 5 to 10 years. But most interestingly, no regulatory body, including the University Grants Commission, will have any say in the governance of these universities. That means that these universities will be free to do whatever they want. They will be free to design their own courses, of course, which to some extent they would be. But in addition, they would be free to recruit anyone in terms of students or faculty. They would be free to start their own courses. They would be free to expand their campuses. They would be free to introduce new collaborations with the world outside. They would be free to create pedagogical innovations or cultivate new pedagogical innovations without having to go to the regulatory body, which otherwise it would be asked to. This would be a leapfrogging exercise. I can tell you, Jindal University has applied, in addition to many other universities, to be part of this IOE list. We don't know, so the results are still underway. But there's a lot of speculation as to whether this policy will result in creating world-class universities at all. Because effectively, even for world-class universities, you need a lot of money. Be that as it may, this is a marked step, in my view, to push certain select key institutions outside the bounds of regulatory bodies, because one of the most important argument against the regulatory bodies was exactly this, that they are unable to, they stifle innovation and growth in a university. I come to my next point. So, I mean, this is regulatory bodies also exist for schools, but I'll come to schools in a bit. The question then that must have, I mean, the next question that must be there in your minds is, you might have heard of some select higher education institutions in India which produce brilliant people or where brilliant research and pedagogical innovations do take place. I'm talking about Indian Institute of Managements, the IIMs, the IITs, Indian Institute of Technologies. For law, you have national law schools here. Have you heard of national law schools in Indian context, some of the best law schools in India? These schools, IITs, IIMs, national law schools, are elite professional schools who also do not stand in the top 100 or 200 universities list of the world. But at the same time, they are still given a high level of importance, largely because they have assumed an elite status in the last 40 years. The reason this happened is classic Darwinian struggle. So when you have millions of applicants trying to secure, so these institutions were established, except the national law schools, the IITs, the Indian Institute of Technologies, and the Institutes of Managements were established in the 1960s and 70s mostly, because at that time the vision was to create professionals in India. And since then they have been able to secure a very high level of status because of very good quality faculty, good funding, and very, very good infrastructure. I would encourage you to visit Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, which is not very far from here. Gives you some sense of, and this is one of the institutions I think that appeared in the Times ranking list. These universities or these schools are able to attract the best of minds because there are obviously some good minds who want to go and study somewhere. But consider this, around 500,000 students sit for the entrance exams of these institutions, and the number of students who get selected into this is close to 4,000 to 5,000 at best. The good ones, the good branches and the good ones amongst the IITs would be hardly 1,000 to 2,000. So we are looking at around 5,000 students out of 500,000 students annually getting selected. The story is the same for Indian Institute of Managements who want to do MBAs. The story is the same for national law schools. The national law schools have even worse selection rate. Out of around 100,000 students who sit for these exams, 300 to 400 students get selected into the top ones. So you are looking at a selection rate of less than 0.01%. This means that these examinations, the entrance examinations, have assumed a cult of their own in Indian higher education. What is this cult? The cult is that you, in order to be successful in life, you have to get into these select colleges. There are a number of IITs, but the good ones are around 5 to 7. Number of IIMs, the good ones are around 5 to 7. Number of national law schools, the good ones are around 3 to 4. So I'm looking at some of the best schools in India numbering around 15. And then you have millions of students who are applying to sit in these exams. So if you get selected into these 15 colleges, well, you have an easy life, a good life, a successful life, and a successful career. If you don't, you may get into a mediocre college which will fail to even signal its own quality. So what happens? You end up taking coaching institution classes to pass in the entrance examinations. Not all colleges and universities in India select students through entrance. They select students through their high school marks, right? But these colleges and most good colleges in India select through entrance, including Jindal for that matter. So entrance exam is a way of screening off people because otherwise the demand is huge and the good quality education the number is very, very small. The coaching institutions in India, the mushrooming of coaching institutions in India is itself a study of its own. These are unregulated coaching classes, and I'm sure there are many in Australia as well. But in India, the numbers are enormously huge. These coaching institutions charge fees which is double or triple the size of the fee of the college for which they are preparing you to enter, but they are always swarmed with people. A particular case study would be for a city of Kota, K-O-T-A. When you read about Kota, which is a small city in Rajasthan, you see that it has suddenly become a coaching institutions town in the last 5 to 10 years. The population in the city has swelled to double its size, mostly comprising of students who come to this city to study for coaching, to study for entrance exam. They spend 2 years, class 11th and class 12th. Indians follow the K-12 system of education. So they spend 2 years studying physics, chemistry, maths, for which possibly they will sit for the entrance exam for Indian Institute of Technologies. These coaching institutions, and this is the most craziest part, these coaching institutions have collaborations with local schools. So these kids do not go to the schools because their aim in life is to clear the entrance exams, and the entrance exam is only looking at physics, chemistry and maths. But in the school you will also have to study English, you have to study Hindi or probably other subjects, you will have to engage in sports, you have to engage in extracurricular activities, so you don't do this for 2 years. And in fact now there are coaching institutions that do this for more than 2 years, 3 to 4 years. So you are in class 9th and you are already in Kota undergoing this coaching institutions for the entrance exam that takes place at the end of class 12th, so that you can get into one of these elite colleges. They go to the schools only at the end of only during the exams, and because the schools have collaborations with the coaching institutions, in some sense I would say the schools have been appropriated by the coaching institutions. It is very easy to imagine a situation where the school principal doesn't care about students who are enrolled in a particular coaching institutions not coming to classes, because on paper they will pass them, but they have to come for the exam. So only for a week or two they will study for the school. all the rest of the days in the year, they are going to study physics, chemistry, and maths. This has led, disastrously actually, suicides of some students who find themselves to be in some sense coerced into studying subjects that they never wanted. Now, in this case, many people might want to blame parents because what is the need? Why do parents need to send their kids and banish them like, in this place? But one of the things is that in India, there's a Darwinian struggle even for jobs for that matter. And if that is the case, you are looking at a society where the only passport to success is a good college. And because there are very few good colleges, we are all having a cutthroat competition to enter into that college. So if you don't get into that college, you will not end up getting a good job. Now, isn't this interesting? Because there are 800 universities in India. But the struggle continues year on, every year, millions of students get disastrously disheartened because they haven't secured their space in those 15, 20 colleges that I mentioned, despite the fact that there are 800 universities in India. And this tells a dismal story about Indian higher education system. While we have been able to create brilliant people, and for that matter, guys, even IITs and IIMs, these colleges are good not because, if they were good, they would be in top 100 or top 20 in the world. They are good because students are good, and obviously you're going to get good students. If you're selecting 100 out of 5,000, they're going to be good students. So when they graduate, they go abroad, they settle down in Google or Facebook, and that is how people think that Indian technology students are actually very brilliant, but you're selecting a very few. A large chunk of majority who does not get into these elite colleges is unable to signal their quality because the signaling value of these universities is so low. Michael Spence, who got a Nobel Prize in economics in 1973, argued that one of the reasons why universities, so of course, universities add value because they add human capital into nation's progress, right? They create human capital. Michael Spence came up with an alternative theory. He said that universities are also important because they also do something called signaling. So when I am trying to employ some people under me, I would like to know whether this person is fit for the job or not, and I cannot know whether this person will be fit or not. But through the university, through the grades, I can get a sense of the extent to which this person will be fit. For that, the university must have a signaling value. The signal that yes, my graduates are going to be useful for the job market. If that signaling value is lost, then there is no point for universities to exist, even though they may be adding a lot of human capital. The good ones still remain, but majority of them will not be able to do this. The funny thing in India is that most universities, and actually most schools, have lost that signaling value. So you will be surprised, and this is also not very public, so very little research on this exists. There are companies in India now, and you know what they do? So I graduate from a particular college, and now I'm going to the job market. My college is not known. It's one of those mediocre colleges. There are 800 universities. I come from one of those mediocre universities in one of the remotest part of India. How will I signal that I am suitable for a particular job to my employer if they have never even heard of that university for that matter? So these companies organize tests, again, stylized, standardized tests, which if I pass, my score in that test after my graduation becomes the signal to my employer that yes, I can be employed in this particular place. The reason why this is interesting is because it in a way renders university education meaningless for a majority of people. I'll tell you the most recent case in the Supreme Court on higher education that took place. This was in November 2017. There are three ways in which you establish universities in India. The central universities, established by the Parliament of India through an act. State university, established through passing of an act in a state legislature. Are you aware of the difference between state, the legislature and the Parliament? So every state, every province has its own legislature, which drafts its own laws. So an act passed in the state legislature. The third route is kind of a controversial route, which is called as deemed to be university, which means you'll either be a central university or a state university or a deemed university, both public and private. At this stage, we don't have any any private university which is central universities. So all central universities are public universities. State universities can be public or private. Jindal is a state private university. And the third one is a deemed to be university. A deemed to be university is a university which has been accorded the status of a university by the University Grants Commission, the apex regulatory body, because for a number of years they have seen that this college, so they give this status to colleges that operate very efficiently for several years, and they are now worthy of being called as universities, but they call themselves deemed to be universities, that these are good enough to be universities who can give their own degrees. What happened in earlier last year, so the story is interesting. Just to quickly tell you the story, there is this engineer who is working in a lift company in Orissa. This guy is working in this, it's a public sector enterprise in which he is working. During the promotional, I don't know which year this happened, but when the promotions were announced, this guy was not given a promotion, which he was sort of expecting or he was generally scheduled for. In public sector enterprises, promotions often take place on the basis of your seniority more than skills, right? So he filed a case against his own company saying that I was scheduled to be promoted and these guys did not do that, possibly because of some sort of nepotism happening. This case led his engineering records to be pulled out. And one of the things that they saw is that he secured his engineering degree in a university, which is a deemed university in Rajasthan, far away. When they found out that, they realized that they went deeper into the Rajasthan's university's structure and pedagogy, and they realized that some of the courses that the university in Rajasthan was offering were those for which it did not get the required approvals from some other regulating bodies. This, of course, forget about this man and his job. Now the question turns to whether this university was, when the university was not allowed to offer certain courses, how was it able to do so? So there is a classic case of regulatory oversight. But in the judgment, and this is, I mean, in Supreme Court judgments in India, court judgments are, they are, so this judgment is 118 pages long. This is how big our judgments are mostly, sadly. Our judges like to write, and they like to write, how do we clean the society of its all ills instead of focusing on the point as much. The real point that they focus is probably at the end, in which, let me read out a particular paragraph which is useful. What they did was, read the paragraph number 52. The present case shows the extent of commercialization of education by some of the deemed universities. The commercialization seriously affects credibility of standards in education, eroding power and essence of knowledge, and seriously affecting excellence and merit. The blah blah blah, UGC had completely failed to remedy the situation. Serious questions has therefore arisen as to the meaning of UGC itself and for its effective working. UGC is the apex governing the regulatory body. We have already found that the facilities of the study centers were never checked, nor any inspections were carried out, which has led to direct suspension of degrees for the students enrolling during this session. So they, in a way, called off these degrees, the students who were graduating from this particular college during year 2001 to 2005. We also find that there was a flagrant violation of norms and policies laid down by the authorities that deemed to be universities. They have written a list of things that needs to be done. One of the things that they have mentioned is that deemed to be universities will not be able to call themselves universities itself, which creates a very funny situation because these universities used to call themselves universities. So Christ University in Bangalore cannot call itself university. It'll be funny that it's going to be called as just Christ. I don't know who wants to go and study in Christ. Or Santosh University, or I don't know, OP Jindal Global University, if we were deemed, would be called as OP Jindal Global, and that's pretty much it. So what is OP Jindal Global? It's deemed to be a university. The point I'm making through this is the funny ways in which our regulations have been drafted by the courts and the myopic views in which courts exercise their power. For them, the problem is a classic paper and a pen problem rather than the substance, rather than a substantial problem of its own right. This has been happening for last 30 years. Courts have been coming up with judgments of their own understanding of universities, and this has led to a huge amount of confusion. AICT is another. Okay. Now look at it this way. This particular judgment, this particular paragraph number 46, suspends all the degrees of students who enrolled in this college without knowing that the college had no approvals and for no fault of their own. Now obviously they did go to this college where they did secure some sort of education, but if this was the reason for suspension of degrees, then in my view, most degrees of most colleges should be suspended, not because they are not fulfilling the norms by AICTE, but because these norms are anyway going to be flouted even if the inspections take place, right? And another interesting thing is most of these private universities are actually run by many politicians or their relatives. So what happens is that even though in India you cannot set up universities for profit, all universities have to be non-profit, a lot of things, a lot of cooking the books happen within these universities. So they become sources of money laundering for many of these politicians. And therefore, a sweeping strategic reform becomes difficult to be implemented or practiced. Yes?
What does this university do with all of its fees if it's non-profit?
With all the fees, oh, they have to invest in the university itself. So it could be faculty salaries, increasing number of courses, increasing the infrastructure or improving the infrastructure. So whatever surplus that is accumulated in universities, on paper, it must be invested back into the university for all kinds of operational expenses or expansion. But so in other words, a non-profit technically would mean no one can be a shareholder of this place, right? So market capital is 0, number of shares is 0, so the value of the share is 0 upon 0, which is undefined. So therefore, all the money has to be shown in the account or back into the investment. But what people do is they often collect many of these things in cash and therefore distribute many things in cash, and so therefore they have a huge amount of profit. Quite practically, most of these private universities are some of the richest universities in terms of money that they make. But on paper, they're all non-profit. Well, you must have heard many Welcome to India stories. This is one of the Welcome to India stories too. Let's read this. Having found the entire exercise of grant of ex post facto approval to be incorrect and illegal, the logical course in normal circumstances would have been not only to set aside such approvals, but also to pass consequential directions to recall all the degrees granted in pursuance thereof. Okay? But then they go further and write, though we cannot wish away the fact that the concern deemed to be universities flagrantly violated and entered into areas where they had no experience and started conducting courses through distance education illegally, the overbearing interest of the concerned student persuades us not to resort to recall of all the degrees in the engineering granted in pursuance of this approval. So in some sense, they are showing sympathy. Now read the next line. Because your law students you might just like how Indian judges write the judgment. Okay, so here there is a sympathy, and then say, however, the fact remains that the facilities available were never checked, nor any inspections were conducted. It is not possible at this length of time to order any inspection, but there must be confidence and assurance about the worthiness of the concerned students. So in other words, what the judges are saying that if the college has not been inspected, the students are not worthy. We therefore deem it appropriate to grant some chance to the concerned students to have their ability tested by the authorities. We therefore direct that all the degrees in engineering granted to students during 2001 and 5 shall stand suspended till they pass such examination under the joint supervision of a particular regulatory body. I mean, think about it this way. These are the students 10 years ago graduated from this college, and now their degrees are worthless until they pass this exam, which is based on what they studied at that time, 5 years. And this is Supreme Court of India. This by no means has as huge implication as many other judgments would have had. But I want you to focus and think about for a moment the thoughtlessness with which regulatory bodies work, and if not, then the thoughtlessness with which the courts offer their judgments in restructuring higher education system. So you think about Indian higher education system, because of courts and regulatory bodies, a mess like Indian roads, where you have access to everything, but then there are no rules, so you figure out your own way. I have spent a lot of time speaking about university education. What I'll do is, I will quickly come to the school education, and maybe I'll show you some data. Are there some questions that you have in terms of particularly the higher education? None whatsoever, okay.
I have one question.
Yes, sure.
Are there any, because there's so much demand for higher education,
Yeah.
are there any attempts to streamline it using online?
Oh, that's a good question. So, guys, this is my prediction, okay? Education system in India, and higher education in particular, is up for major disruption. And I would say, I would go so far to claim that this is again one of those markets like the Bay Area in San Francisco, where the winner will take all. In fact, just last week, the HRD minister, the Human Resource Development Ministry, which takes care of the universities in India, the HRD minister announced creation of universities which will offer education through online courses. India has the largest university, one of the largest universities in the world is an Indian university, which is an open university. It's called IGNOU, Indira Gandhi National Open University, IGNOU. This university is an interesting example, particularly for the things that you asked, because even before online education had started spreading its tentacles, they were offering degree courses through distant education mode. Because most students may not be in a position to be able to come to a place to study, they would send course material by snail mail and then would conduct tests and exams in different centers around the country. So for instance, even I would know many people who had enrolled in IGNOU just so that they get a degree, because otherwise they could not. A, because they were too far away, or B, because they were working on a daily basis to be able to feed their families and they didn't have time to go to a regular course in a regular university. So IGNOU is definitely there. But now the MOOC, the massive online open courses, so that's kind of coming in India in a big way. I know personally some of my friends who have started, the startups, they have started their own tiny businesses of creating online content and delivering it. Internet penetration in India is very high. So there is a lot of promise in that space. But again, I don't think in the near future MOOCs will be able to replace the traditional style of education, because majority of Indians still do not have access to education, access to internet. Second, even in MOOCs, there's like all kinds of things happening rather than any organized structure or any organized way of doing it. The ministry, I'm aware, is particularly open to ideas of online education, and we are only going to rely on innovations taking place in this space for in the next decade. But that's most definitely a very promising possibility in education space. Let me quickly take you through some statistical. Let's see. There's a lot of it, so I'm going to stop if you want me to stop. So this is in general the structure in which our education system is designed. You have pre-primary, primary, secondary, and then higher education. One of the interesting things about higher education is this, guys. You're aware what is an enrollment ratio? Okay, enrollment ratio in this literature is defined by number of students per 100 students who are graduating out of high school and entering a college, right? So if 100 students come out of schools and 20 go to a college, so 20 is the enrollment ratio. So enrollment ratio in India until early 2000s was as small as 7 to 8%. It went up to around 12% at the time Jindal University was established, 2009. At this stage, right now, it is close to 24%. So look at the massive exponential increase of number of students who are now wanting to secure higher education. Just 8 years ago, 12 out of 100 kids went to a college. Now 24 out of 100 are going to the college, which means there is a huge amount of demand. In 2009, the government passed an act called the Right to Education. The Right to Education ensures that every student between the age of 6 and 14 is granted the right to have free and compulsory education, which means that enrollment ratio in primary schools must be very high. That's exactly what we know. India's primary school enrollment ratio is approximately 96%, which means 96 out of 100 kids of that particular age are going to the schools, in primary schools. This enrollment ratio, the graph goes down as and when the classes go up because of very high dropout ratio as well. Now, between these two statistics, the underlying substantive argument is that despite very high level of enrollment ratio, the quality has remained mediocre. In other words, while there is a right to education, there is no right to learning. So how much learning takes place in the schools or colleges is not just a question mark, the jury is out, there's very little. And part of the reason is, I'll talk about that when I show you the data on the learning itself. But right now, let me move to So this is the public sector, private sector. All right. Look at the, so this is the literacy rate. When we got independent, almost 20, so we had 8, so literacy rate was 18%. The literacy rate of females was just 8%. Now we have gone, and you know how is literacy rate defined in India? Literacy rate is defined if you can read and write your own name, which means it doesn't tell you much, right? But even then, this tells you something, that the increase in the number of people who have access to some sort of literacy is really high. So, for instance, I remember my grandmother could read and write, but there were many others of her age who couldn't. But that's not the case in my generation. And I come from an extremely sort of poor neighborhood, and I can therefore vouch for what I'm talking about. I'm talking about even that part of India which you don't know. This is the literacy rate going up. Number of recognized educational institutions. Now this is just the number. Let's look at, okay, so the senior secondary, primary, upper primary, secondary and senior secondary. So we had 7,400 senior secondary schools in India almost at the time of independence, which has gone to a million, almost a million. So this is a stupendous growth in the number, right? The number of colleges or the universities, 27 in 1947 to 700, this is actually 2015 data. By now we have 799 universities, which is the latest. Gender parity, this is interesting, female to male. Look at the way gender parity for the primary school at the time of independence so we got independence in 47. So I would imagine 1950-51 is almost the time of independence. So less than half in a primary classroom, less than half the students were females, which has now gone up actually. So there are more females in the primary school. But interestingly, in the senior secondary, the females are still lower in number, and that the same goes for higher education. I can forward these slides to you. If there's something in particular which strikes your eye, alert me and we can discuss. But I'm going faster because there are a lot of tables, and I think I still have 15 minutes. 15 minutes, right? Okay. Yeah. This is showing the trend of the gender parity, which clearly in primary school to secondary and then tertiary. Yeah, we've done this. This is level-wise enrollment. So this is an enrollment in numbers. The enrollment ratio is in percentage. So numbers gives you some sense of how many people are enrolled. Now this slide is also interesting because this tells you the size of our higher education or our education system. So let's look at the level-wise enrollment in primary. Primary, which is class 1 to class 5, we have, so you know these numbers are in lakh. 1 lakh is 100,000. Okay, so 10 lakh is 1 million. In other words, in 2014 and 15, a total of 13 million people were enrolled, 13 million students were enrolled in class 1 to 5, which means we are talking about a massive population within the school. By the way, guys, half of India's population is below the age of 25. So education itself is some sort of skill set itself, or demography is a ticking time bomb. It could be a demographic disaster if education system is not resolved, or education system does not fix itself. For as long as education system remains dismal, we are going to create this enormous size of people in terms of population who are going to be dissatisfied, who are going to be jobless, who are going to be frustrated. And then we might probably actually look at in future coming off a demagogue who will probably win elections, throwing promises to these people. I mean, look at it this way. History has shown this, that when youth is frustrated, usually nations do not move forward in the way they should be going. This is what happened in Germany. This is what happened in China. This has been happening around the world. And this is, so what 10 years ago we would call as demographic dividend, that we have so many young people, so there are so many jobs available, which means so much of growth that can happen, might actually turn into a demographic disaster if these kids come out without sufficient skills from colleges which are rather mediocre, not being employable. A number of studies by federations of chambers of commerce and industries in India and elsewhere have shown how unemployable our graduates are. Part of the reason is because of the poor quality of education system. But I want you to see the numbers. The numbers are massive. So this is 34 million 34 million students are enrolled in colleges today, which is a big deal. Like, this is a sizable number. What is the population of Australia? Sorry? 23 million. So this is more than, almost 1.5 times the size of Australia is what we have people in colleges, with a 25% enrollment ratio, which means 3 times this number would be people who would be of the age between 18 and 23. And this is crazy. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Even when I talk about it, think about the size, it just goes, and therefore your question was important. I mean, unless we move to an online system which has scale, this is going to be a huge disaster. This is enrollment ratio. The enrollment ratio is now 24.3 for higher education. For females, it's 21 and males is 25. But interestingly, notice that enrollment ratio, guys, can you see enrollment ratio is more than 100 here? How is that possible? Enrollment ratio is number of kids who are in school divided by number of kids who should be in school. That's because the enrollment ratio is based on age, and whenever you see enrollment ratio above 100, which means that even older kids are sitting in these classes, which means number of people who should be less than the people who are there. But enrollment ratio is decreasing across the schools. So it has come to 50% in senior secondary, which has started at 90%. In other words, students are dropping out. So 96 out of 100 kids go into the primary school, but by the time they are in senior secondary, 11th and 12th, only 50 of them remain. The rest have dropped out for all kinds of considerations, largely financial considerations, because they have now started to work. Number of female students per male students, look at the increase in graph. In higher education, there were 13 per 100, and now there are 85, which is still less. But this also shows some sort of, the promise here is of receptivity of parents to send their girl children in the schools as well. This is the dropout rate. The dropout rate remains almost the same for both boys and girls, but in senior secondary, the girls drop out faster. Almost everywhere, the girls are dropping out faster. Upper primary, girls are dropping out faster, except the primary. So except the primary, the girls are dropping out faster for a variety of reasons. And those reasons are some of the commonsensical reasons that, what could be the reasons? Why is the girl dropout rate higher than?
They're getting married off.
They get married. They get married early, so that could be one reason. What are the other reasons? In fact, Guardian had a piece. Many times girls are often asked not to attend schools the moment they attain puberty, particularly in small towns and villages, so as to reduce the possibility of sexual harassment cases outside. So these kind of cases you may not find as much as in cities, but parents would rather want them to get. And Guardian had a long story on this as to how many girls end up dropping out of schools earlier than boys because they are then they suffer. It's like the boys bullying them when they are teenagers, and they go and tell their parents, and the parents are like, okay, then stop going to schools. Something of that sort. It's very difficult to imagine it as Australians for you, but it's very easy for me to imagine in the context in which India is. Very interestingly, guys, recently I did a study on the school voucher programs. What's a school voucher? Are you aware of what's a school voucher concept? Okay, so this is a very interesting concept that was popularized in America mostly by Hayekian ideas, that when governments give money to schools, it might lead schools to be inefficient because there is no monitoring mechanism whether schools are doing good or bad. So an alternative is that the government starts giving vouchers, which is cash vouchers, to the students, to the kids, and then the kids go to the school wherever they want to. And for schools to be able to attract good students, because then they will get the cash voucher, they should be good. Because if they're not good, kids will not go into those schools. Do you get the logic of school vouchers? So kids will be, because money lies with the students, not with the schools have to really act good. Otherwise, the students won't come to them. And if the students don't come, the cash vouchers won't come to them. So this is like a classic market dynamics in which you create competition among schools to attract students. When I conducted this survey in India, in a particular low-income neighborhood in Delhi, I found something fascinating. You see, most Indians today I mean, when I look at the enrollment numbers, these are crazy numbers. The number of enrollments itself. While let's look at the primary. 1 million to 13 million in 50 years, which means the numbers are so high, gives me a reason to believe that most people who go to schools and colleges today are actually first generation learners. So their parents are not educated. And that's an important aspect of education in India, which you will not find in most countries in the world, where education is the size is increasing by leaps and bounds of a population whose parents are totally uneducated. You have 34 million people in colleges, as opposed to, so somebody who is now enrolled in college, parents would have gone to college somewhere around 70s, 33. From 33, so 3 million to 34 million, right? If they're all first generation learners, then and we are talking about primary or secondary school, then the decision of which school to go to and whether they should go to the school or not lies with the unlearned generation, which is the parents. So in my survey, I found that when kids don't secure good marks in their schools, parents blame the children rather than the schools, because they feel the child must not be studying. Why would be a school so bad? The reason is because they've never been to the school themselves to be able to make this assessment. So school vouchers, and this was the conclusion of, I wrote this with one of my co-authors, we concluded that school voucher programs cannot be implemented in India unless, because the switching cost is high for the parents. When you have first generation learners, school voucher programs may not be necessarily very successful. And this creates Indian education system some sort of an interesting irony, where you are asking uneducated people to send their kids to school, so they see the promise, because they are uneducated themselves. But at the same time, because they are uneducated, they are unable to make the assessment of whether it is good or bad, which means the cycle continues, even if it is a mediocre institution. Pupil-teacher ratio, this is, I don't think this is something of particular interest to me. This is public expenditure. Okay, so this is interesting. Total amount of expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP. In general, good major big countries would have a figure of 6 to 10% of their entire GDP budget invested in education, primary, secondary, higher, whatever. In India, this has hardly reached 4%. Even now, it's close to 4.2%, which means we are spending very little part of our GDP in education. Speaks volumes of the priorities at the policy level. Given the fact that time is almost up, there were a couple of other documents I could have sent. If I open it, there will be opening Pandora's box. Let's see, this is higher education. So this was E&Y report. It's a trashy report, but it has data. So I can actually take a look at, they always have trashy reports, frankly.
Why are they trashy?
Sorry?
Why are they trashy?
Well, because the analysis is, this is my view. When you read, the analysis is very, very surface analysis. So there's no really in-depth analysis. And this is something that they have done for private investors who want to enter into school education. So this is all about, the promise the school education has, you should invest in India, and things like that. So there's a clear agenda that you can see, which is why it's trashy. But it has data, which is what I'm looking at. So, I can send it to you, but let me show you certain things which okay. So you see the enrollment ratio, the yellow, and gross enrollment ratio is, so the one in, so this one is number and this is the percentage. It's dropping down from primary to senior secondary. So huge dropout rates. Okay, this is one. Grade 5 has the highest dropout. So they study until grade 4 and then they suddenly drop out in this one. This is again the dropout rates of boys and girls, and you notice that the girls, in the last few years, the girls' dropout rate has been lower than the boys, which is kind of an interesting. And this is secondary schools. The girls' dropout rate has been decreasing in the last few years. Percentage, okay, that's not important. Let's see. Okay, this is interesting. I would like you to spend just a minute on this particular table. So Pratham is a non-profit organization which comes up with what we call as ASER reports, Annual Survey of Education Reports, ASER. What they do is they go to villages and small towns and other places and collect do independent surveys to find out how much learning is happening. So most of the data until Pratham started coming up with ASER reports was based on numbers alone. How many students are there in class 1, how many students in class 5, dropout rates, how many male, how many female, and so on and so forth. Pratham for the first time started conducting surveys in which they were also able to assess how much learning is happening. So this table shows, let me expand this, okay. All India rural reading level of children in different grades. So they do reading comprehensions, tests in different classes in these schools, and they do mathematics abilities. And what they do is they pull out some standardized, so for instance, grade 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. If you read this line, you'll get a better sense. So in grade 3, 11.9% children cannot even read letters. They can't read nothing. They can read letters, so 26%. 26.2% can read letters but not words. That means A, B, C, D but not word. 23% can read words but not grade 1 text, and this is in grade 3. Grade 1 text or higher. 17% can read grade 1 text but not grade 2. So we are looking at this particular grade 3. Okay, this is being explained. And only 21% can read grade 2 level text. Okay, so they give them reading assignments in the schools, in the classes, and then they ask them to read this. And then they create these databases. When ASER reports started to come out, now they come up with annual ASER reports, it shook the education industry by storm because government's promise of very high enrollment ratio was actually baseless or meaningless, because you may have 100 people sit in the classroom, but they're not learning anything. That doesn't make sense, right? So what the government then started to do is to invest efforts in learning abilities. The recent ASER report, 2017 ASER reports, shows improvement in all these data and variables, so which is good. But this still gives you some sense of the quality. One of the reasons of poor quality school education is absenteeism of teachers themselves. And this is largely because school education posts, university faculty positions, they're all kind of permanent jobs, government jobs for Indians, so they're highly politicized. It becomes very easy. So let me give you another statistic. In Delhi University, almost half the faculty positions are vacant. And one of the reasons is the bureaucracy involved. And when you give a job to anyone at the level of school or colleges, you are giving the person a job for life, so there is a huge amount of corruption involved. So people pay a lot of money to enroll themselves as teachers in schools because they get paid a huge amount of money, but with little oversight, no incentive to make efforts to teach kids, and therefore very little incentive to create learning outcomes within the schools. Another policy in India is that many of these school teachers, actually all school teachers, have to be necessarily transferred within the state to a different school every 3 years. So while somebody is teaching in Sonipat school, in 3 years will be transferred to another school far away. This transferring also creates politicization of the positions, but more importantly, lack of belongingness and lack of incentive to make efforts to teach. And teacher absenteeism leads to students' absenteeism as well. Very interestingly, so that students come to the school, a couple of decades ago, the government came up with something called as, and this is fascinating, only in India you can have such a thing, something called midday meal scheme. Have you heard of this scheme? So midday meal scheme means that everyone who comes to school will get food compulsorily, free of cost. Midday meal schemes increased the attendance in the school by a whopping almost double or more. So kids would come to the school because they will get food to eat, and this would be an incentive for the parents also to send kids to school. Now there are two things. One is, imagine the poverty where food becomes an incentive for kids to come to school. But second, when kids come to school, the idea is they will learn something rather than sitting at home. And the third level is, if there was no food, kids weren't coming to the school because A, either the teacher wasn't there, and B, even if the teacher was there, maybe the quality of education was so poor that the father or mother would rather have the child sit on the shop or sell vegetables along with him and sort of share, and help in his daily wage. Anyway, this is a big report. I can go on and on, but I want to stop here because this is, yeah, this is just, okay, let me just tell you this one last thing. Because of the poor quality of education in government schools, look at the huge amount of private schools that have emerged in India, and this is state-wise. So the yellow lines are of the private schools, and the grey is the government schools. So in states like Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, then Gujarat, West Bengal, Kerala, Haryana, all of these states, there are far more private schools than the government schools. Interestingly, total number of private schools, majority of the students, so the ratio of number of students to schools is much higher in private schools. So you have around 20 to 30% of schools in India private, but they have 40% enrollment compared to the other way around, where you have like 60 to 70% schools government, but they have around 60% enrollment, which means the per unit school, higher number of people want to go to private schools. So Uttar Pradesh, for instance, the second one, is one of the poorest states in the country, but it has one of the largest number of private schools. So extremely poor state, going to private school, paying high level of fees, which means that parents are willing to spend money, but they don't trust the government education system. That kind of changes when you go towards south. South of India, Tamil Nadu, then over there, Karnataka, Rajasthan, sorry, Andhra Pradesh, not even Rajasthan actually. And therefore there are regional variations in how schooling is, what is the impression, what is the reputation of government schools or private schools in different parts of India. Let me actually close my discussion over here, because there's, like I said, it's a tall order to continue talking about. Yeah, that would be pretty much it. I mean, I had few other things to mention, but hopefully I can engage in conversation with some of you. If you feel like, you can always write to me. Is there any question that I can address at this stage? Anything specific that kind of stands out? Write to me in case there's something specific, and I'll be happy to direct you to some sort of readings on education system. You may, education system in India is probably going to be the reason for its for India's economic debacle in future, or possibly improvement in future. But everything lies here. I am making again two claims. It's up for huge disruption, and if we don't set it right, we're going to get into a huge demographic disaster. Yes.
I was just wondering if you had a percentage of how many students go. There's a huge demand for tertiary education. Do you have any idea of what percentage of students go overseas to?
Oh, overseas. I can send it to you. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's an important point. In terms of percentage, it's small, but it's an absolute number, it's huge. So much so that foreign universities are wanting to set up their campuses in India. But so in India, FDI in higher education is allowed, but because there is no special law, Foreign University Act, the structure with which universities can open, for instance, Monash University wants to set up their own campus in India, that would not be possible because Monash is waiting, or like any other university, they are waiting for an act to come in India, which can then explain how this structure is going to be governed. So FDI is allowed. Now the thing is, because the strong lobby of many politicians and others, they are not opening this space for foreign universities. So the reason why these universities want to come is because the number is huge. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but if you write to me, I will be happy to give the data. Otherwise you can just quickly search. The interesting thing is this. University of Chicago, even Harvard has an office in Bombay. University of Chicago has an office in Delhi. I think Pennsylvania also has it. I'm not quite sure. But these universities have their offices which do kind of research work here and there. Sitting here, and I know my friends who work in law firms, like Covington for instance, who advise universities in the US to open their shops in different places. They've already done it in Middle East. They are all sitting like hawks. The moment India opens its markets, all of these universities will open their campus. I'm not aware of Monash, but definitely many American universities. That might be the game changer, and I must say this. Because what happens is that it creates a body of students who are unable to get into these elite colleges, suddenly opens doors for new universities, and because if, let's say, Pennsylvania opens its campus, they're going to maintain quality because it's brand name, or if Monash opens a campus. In fact, one of my first op-eds that I wrote in the newspaper is that India should open its doors to foreign universities, because that's one way out, because we have not been able to refine our own. And part of the reason why they want to come is because of significant number of students from India who travel abroad for higher education. also in China. Yeah, I think he raised the hands first. Do you have a point?
What are the main concerns from the lobbyists that are going against opening the doors?
What the argument?
Yeah.
Well, most of these lobbyists are worried that there. So imagine like SRM University that you went to possibly. SRM University is decently impressive in terms of its campus infrastructure, but doesn't stand much in terms of its reputation of, let's say, good quality faculty or otherwise. So SRM will find its students, or even for that matter, Jindal students, not applying to Jindal, but going here. So it ends up. So the argument is at two levels against it. Number one is this will be a direct assault on existing universities, many of which are run by these politicians, right? So it's a classic sort of turf war. The second and more important argument is that this seems to be one of those self-glorifying, rather hollow and vacuous claim that we are so proud that we will create our own education system. We do not want foreigners to come and teach us, even though we have been failing to do so. But this is some sort of a self-glorifying image that we want to protect, or these lobbies want to create and protect. So the moment we open the universities, foreign universities to come, the opposition parties are going to claim, well, the government couldn't do anything for our higher education system, so now they're asking all of these people to come and teach us as if we can't teach ourselves. Do you see that? And then this goes into that whole colonization argument and so on and so forth. So this is used as an academic argument against it. So many scholars also have it, and for good reasons maybe. But really the heart of the matter is the reason why law firms, foreign law firms are not allowed in India is because we know the Indian law firms are going to feel much of the carpet pulled out of under their own feet. Huge amount of revenues are going to be then shared because many big companies will simply go to Covington or Herbert Smith or Allen and Overy if they set up their shops. So law firm lobby is very strong to ensure that they don't come. In a similar way, universities lobbies are also there. But like I said, in university there's another angle, which is that we want to teach ourselves. We don't want the foreigners to come and teach. This is what happened when British came. The whole discourse then becomes extremely convoluted in this particular type of. So these are the two arguments. Yeah, answer question?
Is a foreign online degree worth anything in India?
Foreign online?
Yeah.
But that degree would not be. So you're saying a foreign university?
Yeah, you said they're deregulating, is that right?
Yeah, so what they're saying is that Indian universities can offer online degrees. I'm not aware, does Monash offer online degrees?
Online subjects.
But no, I don't think they're completely online.
You can't do a full degree.
You can't do degree, you can do courses. So you can do Coursera, I think Coursera, etc. do give degrees. And these degrees have their own values, but they haven't reached a stage where they can replace the traditional degrees in India. But I don't see it very far happening. So it is possible that Coursera degrees will assume more importance in Indian context than the degrees that we give in all kinds of mediocre colleges. But the question that you're asking is interesting one because I don't know of any university that gives an entire degree online, unless it's a good university.
Even Swinburne does them.
Yeah, so these universities will not attract, again it depends, relative to Jindal of course it wouldn't be that valuable. But relative to a rather crazy useless university sitting somewhere in the remote part of India where there is no good quality education known, this could be a useful exercise. But I don't know whether Indian students are opting for it because like I said, the online open courses system, that whole thing is now slowly gaining receptivity. To offer an online degree from Swinburne, let's say in India, would be sort of moving ahead of the curve, where very few takers would be found. And in that sense, I would say there's some sort of a path dependency that we would like to get traditional degrees, unless, so let's say if tomorrow Monash starts offering online degrees in India, there'll be